Developer Rebellion has a strong track record of delivering on in-house tech. Their proprietary Azura engine delivers solid performance across a range of platforms, including the Nintendo Switch, but there's definitely a sense that the core engine technology is of a distinctly last-gen vintage, lacking certain key features we've come to associate with current-generation software. Their latest effort, Sniper Elite Resistance, is another cross-gen title, so it's probably best to temper technical expectations somewhat. But has the engine been pushed further than what we saw in 2022's Sniper Elite 5? And how does performance and image quality fare across all 4 current-gen consoles? From a technical perspective, Sniper Elite Resistance does some things quite well. Each level in Resistance takes place in a wide open map, with tons of enemy AI and a large number of routes to explore. That's the core of the Sniper Elite gameplay loop, and everything works just like you'd expect, with convincing enemy behavior across the entire map and no real technical hiccups to speak of. Visually, I think Resistance does a great job of depicting environments at scale. Many of the game's levels have lush, abundant foliage, along with draw distances that push impressive detail deep into the player view. The levels generally look good from just about any position or angle, with bombed-out buildings, bunkers, and churches often taking center stage. Lighting in outdoor scenes also looks reasonably good, with strong direct lighting, even in nighttime scenes, and good-looking shadows. Interiors, though, are a bit more mixed. There are moments where the diffuse indirect lighting looks great, like underneath this archway, but there are a greater number of moments with more questionable lighting quality. Certain areas, like this underground passage or this brick interior, can look a little bit bizarre, as the lighting doesn't really correspond at all to the actual lights present in the scene. Rebellion is relying heavily on SSAO as a kind of indirect lighting hack to make environments look richer, but it's super thick and applied indelicately. There isn't a high-quality GI solution to handle the complex lighting interaction in these areas, so the lighting can fall apart somewhat on close inspection. That's also sometimes true in outdoor areas that are blanketed in shade, where objects can appear to glow in some conditions. Beyond those details, Resistance fits pretty well with a lot of last-gen software. The game assets, many of which are derived from photogrammetry, look reasonably good but unexceptional, with some slightly flat areas at times. Reflections are handled using a mix of SSR and cube maps, again a very typical last-gen approach. That's not really too much of a slight though, because Rebellion is shipping this game on current and last generation platforms simultaneously, so visual progression isn't necessarily something that you would expect. If we flash back to 2022's Sniper Elite 5, I think the overall visual character of both titles is very similar. It's hard to pinpoint anything in particular that takes Resistance above and beyond 5. That also applies to the series' signature visual element, the X-ray kill cameras. These shots track the path of your bullet through an enemy, providing a visual reward for carefully placed weapons fire. Sniper Elite 5 and Resistance provide very similar X-ray views, which look great. I do still slightly prefer the approach taken by Sniper Elite 4, which sometimes provided a more visceral visual result. Of course, if these shots aren't to your taste, they can be reduced in frequency or disabled entirely. Resistance looks good enough for what it is. It's artistically fairly sound, and on a basic technical level, the stages and enemy encounters proceed smoothly. But the state of the art moves ever onwards, and I'd love to see a true current-gen effort from Rebellion, or perhaps another of their boundary-pushing Switch ports, which are legitimately very impressive considering the hardware. In 2025 on PS5 Pro, Resistance looks decent, but would have perhaps benefited from a stronger current-gen focus. The other rendering issue with Resistance comes down to image quality. Resistance suffers from a lot of aliasing of various kinds. The game is stricken with constant edge artifacts in almost every scenario, which are particularly clear when looking at distant geometry. Unfortunately, Resistance just doesn't make use of very effective anti-aliasing. TAA solutions are out of the picture here, let alone more advanced temporal upsamplers like FSR2. It's possible that a light post-process technique could be in use here, but if present, it is very light. The PC version doesn't have options for any anti-aliasing methods, nor selections for any particular kind of upscaling. We've been looking at PS5 Pro footage so far, and the game does promise a PS5 Pro enhancement. But after taking a look at a number of shots, it looks like the game uses a dynamic 2160p resolution on the Premium and Pro current-gen consoles. It's just that the resolution on Pro is higher than the base PS5, typically settling at a full 4K in more sedate shots, which is also typical of the Series X. Outside of resolution differences, the three consoles look very similar in my testing, without obvious divergence in other settings. Thankfully, the higher-end current-gen platforms offer a pretty steady 60 FPS update in my experience. I'm playing pretty guns blazing here on the lowest difficulty to stress test the game and rarely ran into dips. Sometimes sudden changes in camera position can drop a frame or two, with the DRS system perhaps not keeping pace completely. Big explosions can also cause drops, especially when scoped in. But outside of those very minor issues, it's a typically faultless 60 FPS. The situation on Series S is a little more interesting. Resolution takes a cut, decreasing from 4K in these shots on Series X to typically around 1080p on Series S. That means more aggressive edge artifacts that alias over a larger area of the screen. Nothing out of the ordinary there though. What I did find unusual is that the game targets 30 FPS on Series S. To its credit, it's a faultless 30 FPS refresh in my experience, without framerate stumbles, so it's not bad for a Series S version. But a 60 FPS mode, at least as one option, would be typical on the S, especially in a cross-gen game. It's especially curious because Sniper Elite 5 originally targeted 60 FPS on Series S 3 years ago, delivering a slightly rocky 60 FPS update with frequent dips. But when I revisited the game on the S for this piece, I found that it too now has a 30 FPS lock in place. It seems that at some point in the last few years, Rebellion has changed their Series S approach to favor lower frame rate experiences. I don't think that's a bad trade-off necessarily, but I wouldn't mind seeing a proper 60 FPS option as well, preferably one that makes all the resolution and settings compromises needed to hit a decently consistent 60 FPS on Series S hardware. That should be possible, though it might not be especially pretty. There is a certain efficiency to Sniper Elite Resistance production that I admire. It arrives slightly less than 3 years after Sniper Elite 5 and packs a fully featured campaign with multiplayer offerings and a number of different modes. Relying on very similar engine technology certainly helps, as does taking usual Sniper Elite production shortcuts, like using relatively static, simple cutscenes between levels. In a world where AAA titles often spend upwards of 5 years in development, perhaps this is an alternative, hopefully more sustainable game development model. But at the same time, there are certain characteristic faults that could have seen some attention in the time between the two titles. Various lighting and asset issues can be chalked up to the strains of cross-gen development, but the lack of anti-aliasing treatment is harder to excuse. Resistance is clear, sharp, and detailed, but it shimmers like few other modern games. Gamers have become more and more sensitive to image quality issues like aliasing in recent years, and this feels like a bit of a blast from the past. Fortunately, performance is strong, logging a solid 60 FPS on the higher end consoles and a locked 30 FPS on Series S. That consistent update is a bit of a breath of fresh air. The game itself is also a good deal of Sniper Elite fun. In terms of the core mechanics, level design, and UI, this is very much a retread of Sniper Elite 5, though that's not necessarily a bad thing. The mix of planning, stealth, and long-range action is compelling enough, and I think series veterans will get a kick out of this entry. Like the graphics though, I'm not seeing a clear progression past that last game, and there's still occasional clunkiness with basic camera and character movement that feels out of place for a new game in 2025. So for better or for worse, this is a hit of Sniper Elite content that looks and feels much the same as the last Sniper Elite entry. That's definitely going to appeal to a lot of players, but there's little new here to draw the eye. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.